Hey guys, welcome to another painting video. Today let's talk about why you should expand your horizons as a painter and try painting large-scale models to get better even at smaller scales.
If you have been following the channel, you have probably noticed that I paint mostly Warhammer models, with Infinity being a close second. Both of these are gaming systems where you can use the models to play a wargame on the tabletop, and both are set in a detailed fictional universe with quite a bit of lore behind them. I don't really play the games, but I love the lore, and most of all I think these are some of the best designed models you can get if you want to paint minis.
But there is one more thing that is true for both of these model ranges. They are true miniatures done at roughly 32mm scale, meaning that they are really small. And this size comes with a lot of implications for us painters.
But behind the widely available 32mm scale models based on well-known universes and game systems, there is a road less traveled with a lot of small companies producing much larger figures, usually scaled between 75 and 100mm, and busts that are even bigger than that. These figures are usually quite unique, each one of them telling its own story instead of being part of a larger universe and lore, and their design can vary a lot even within the same manufacturer's range depending on who sculpted them. And to the surprise of probably no one, I have collected quite a few of these over the last couple of years, but despite the abundance of unpainted figures inside my drawers, you might have noticed a distinct lack of painted ones on both my YouTube and my Patreon.
And there is a reason for that, and that is fear. You see, at this point I feel I'm quite qualified to paint any 32mm scale model to a reasonably high standard if I set my mind to it. But somehow I built up these larger scale models to something scary in my head, to the point where I was putting off painting them until I reached some self-imposed skill level, so that I wouldn't ruin them when I finally dare touch my brush to the first one.
But recently I decided that it's time to finally man up and simply start painting. I would just do my best with the first one and keep improving from there. And that is exactly what I did, and I painted Alana the Bloody Blade, a beautifully designed 75mm figure produced by Big Child Creatives. So in this video let's talk a little about what I learned from that experience and why you should also try your hands at larger scale models, if for no other reason than to improve your 32mm painting skills. And as usual, if you want to know all the details of how I painted Alana and watch a lot more real-time painting footage of the process, then you can find the detailed PDF painting guides and time-lapse videos over on my Patreon, so check those out. So first of all, let me give you a sense of how large these models are compared to some of the figures you might know. Here is Alana compared to a Warhammer Dreadnought and a larger Infinity tag. And here she is next to some Space Marine Terminators and a couple of tiny ladies from the Infinity range. As you can see, she's quite a bit bigger, but still quite manageable. You don't need any additional tools just to paint these larger models. I was using the same painting handles, the same paints and brushes, so no nasty surprises there. And you don't necessarily need an airbrush to paint these models either, although as usual, it's really beneficial if you have one and know how to use it. I use the airbrush mainly for the skin and then later for adding some additional tones onto the metals, but both of these things could also have been done by brush. But that brings me to the first thing that made me fear painting these models. Painting good looking skin on minis is an art in itself, and when you paint mostly wargaming figures, you are mostly restricted to painting tiny faces and maybe a couple of hands and arms here and there. And these big models usually have a lot of exposed skin for one reason or the other, and it's one thing to make a tiny face look alright, but Alana here has more skin showing than an entire Space Marine Legion, and that is a whole different challenge to make look believable and interesting. So you can probably see why I was a little apprehensive of starting a model like this with my paltry experience with painting skin, but I had a little bit of practice with faces lately, and I have watched a lot of YouTube and Patreon videos, so I felt that I had a chance.
There are quite a few tricks to achieve good looking skin, and the nice thing about it is that you can also employ most of them on smaller scale figures, and they are much more forgiving of mistakes in this regard. So if you can paint 75mm skin, you will also get better at smaller scales.
And since it's skin, and especially female skin, we have to make it smooth, which can be a challenge on a larger surface like this. You can use the airbrush to a certain extent, like I did here for the first highlight layers, but if you really want to get contrast, you still need to go in with the brush as well and then use either brush or airbrush glazes to smooth out the transitions. But in the end, what really sells good looking skin is the colors you use. On the face of a Space Marine, you can use the good old method of applying lighter and lighter pinkish flesh colors, maybe transitioning to a little yellow if you are more experienced, and the end result will be passable. And believe it or not, you can use this as a baseline here as well. That is why you saw me paint a nice solid foundation of darker pinkish color first with the brush and then transitioning to more and more yellowish tones in the highlights. But this is not enough to sell this as skin. On larger surfaces like this, your eyes can make out a lot more detail, so we need to make sure that there is enough visual interest for your eyes to feast on. So I added more tones by glazing a little magenta into the shadows, and then I switched to super thin down laser yellow to make the skin come alive. And you probably saw me use these tricks in other videos as well, but here there is enough space to really see its effects. For example, the laser yellow is an almost fluorescent greenish yellow tone. The yellow will make the highlights next to them pop more, while the green will make the skin look more alive, since natural skin has a slight greenish cast due to the veins running under it.
So using green and yellow might seem crazy for skin, but it's actually quite essential on these larger scales, and in tiny amounts it also works wonders on smaller scales as well.
But I felt that it was still not enough. I added more contrast to the skin by emphasizing the highlights with the brush. And it's quite scary to paint large smudges over the perfectly smooth airbrush layers, but you have to have confidence in the process and trust that you can smooth them out with some glazes. And then it was time to add even more tones into the shadows and the midtones. I was using mostly reds and magentas to smooth things out, which is nothing crazy after what we have already done, but my favorite is the moody green-blue I used to simulate the environment she would be standing in. She will pose on a rock directly at the edge of the water, and the greenish blue of the ocean should be slightly reflected on the skin, especially on her legs, which are closer to the water. And with that, I managed to paint some quite interesting looking skin. It has quite a bit of contrast, it's nice and vibrant, and it has a lot of interesting color variations that fool your eyes into thinking that you're looking at something real.
It's not the best skin anyone has ever painted, but for the first try it looks quite good, I think, and I learned a lot that I can use in the next project. And I can use the same colors and little tricks on smaller models as well, slightly simplified, but still using the same principles. Okay, so one of the big scary things about painting large-scale models is taken care of. Let's see what else is there.
The good news is that there is a lot of transferable skill between the large and the small-scale painting processes, and that goes both ways. All the same elements that you need to paint on science fiction and fantasy miniatures are still there, so you still need to take care of the hair, the clothes, and the various types of leathers and armors. In some cases, the method is exactly the same as the one you would use on the smaller models. For example, if you have painted the hair of some female figures lately, or like me, you finished a nice decorative wolf belt on Horus's shoulders, then you will know all the principles you need to paint hair and fur on the larger models as well. You just have more area to cover. The hair elements on this model were nicely sculpted with lots of detail, and it's enough to just paint what is already there, but larger models will inevitably have bigger areas with less sculpted detail as well. For example, her headscarf is mostly a big smooth surface. I can and will add some imperfections to make it more interesting, but it might not be enough to avoid it looking boring. So here we can add some details that are not actually pre-sculpted for us. I simply followed the box art here and added a basic freehand pattern, but it still adds a lot of visual interest to an otherwise quite plain part of the model. This is one of the scary but also exhilarating things about big scales. There is a lot more space on them to do your own thing, like some battle scars or tattoos, and you actually have to fill in the space. But if you're not keen on freehands, you can still do a lot with color variations and little details and wear and tear. For example, the leathers you can paint the same way as on a 32mm figure, but you can add more details or do different color variations of the material, once again to give enough visual interest to the observer's eyes. On a smaller model, I might paint all the leather elements with the same colors, but here I painted two different types of leather. And I used the same scratches I use on smaller scales as well to represent it, but here I added more of them and in finer detail. Another bit that can be super scary to paint is the face and the eyes, but here the scale will determine how different it will actually be compared to a 32mm model. Alana's 75mm face, for example, is not that much bigger than a larger face on a smaller scale mini. This means that I can use the same technique for both. I have to simply make it a little more detailed here compared to a 32mm scale. But if you take the bust-sized version of Alana, for example, and yes, I do have that as well, you can see that the face is now much bigger and it needs a lot of additional details. I'm yet to attempt a larger bust-sized face, but I'll report back when I do. But here I did the usual thing of base coating the eye sockets and mouth with a darker reddish color, but importantly not black. Then I painted the whites, once again not with pure whites, inside this, leaving an outline of the darker color. Normally I would just dot in the eyes with some black, but here I actually had barely enough space to use a blue color and then put a little white dot inside that as well to make the eyes a little more alive.
Ultimately, all these elements can be painted quite similarly to 32mm models, but you have a little more space to work with, so you can practice adding more details, creating more color variations and visual interest. And then you can simplify it slightly and apply it to smaller scales as well.
And now we come to the part that I dreaded the most, painting metallics at these larger scales. As we already established, some of these models have a lot of exposed skin, but some of them also have a lot of metal armor, and some, like Alana here, have both. And there is a reason for this. Skin and metals are some of the most challenging things in mini painting, but therefore also some of the most fun things to do. Painting with true metals simply is not an option here in my opinion, and non-metallic metals are difficult enough to do on smaller scales, but here they should be super hard. Or are they? Well, it seems the answer is yes and no. I love painting non-metallic metal on minis, it's my favorite challenge these days, and with each attempt I'm getting a little better at it. But on smaller scales you can get away with mostly just playing with contrast and using relatively few tones to achieve something that looks decent, especially from a distance. Here my little party tricks would be quickly exposed though, since the size won't hide them. So I have to use all the things we have talked about, adding more and finer details, lots of additional tones and extra effects that are not necessarily dictated by the sculpt of the model. But the additional area also means that there is a lot more room for me to paint something believable, and I am not restricted by how much I can physically fit on there. So non-metallic metal at this scale is more technically demanding, but it's also physically easier. You don't need an electron microscope and nanofiber brushes to achieve it. Now, as we established earlier, the model will be standing on a rock at the edge of the sea, and I already added a hint of this on the skin, but metals are way more reflective, so instead of the usual bluish or neutral grays, I will be using a lot of greens right from the get-go. And instead of just doing a simple transition from dark to light on the various armor pieces, I will be doing multiple, 2 or even 3 reflections in some places, which is much easier here because there is so much more space. The overall principles of painting non-metallic metals are the same, but due to the additional area we can and should create more detail. I want the armor to be worn and dented, so I add a lot of scratches and little marks everywhere. This will also make the large flat surfaces more interesting to look at. And once I reach the brightness I need, it's time to add more tones as well. I use the laser yellow again that I also glazed on the skin to give the midtones an even warmer greenish tone and make the bright highlights look even brighter in contrast. To sneak in some more color and also add more details, I use some orange-brown colors to create a rust effect in the nooks and crannies of the armor and around the rivets where the sea water would gather and corrode the metal. Finally, I used the same gloomy green blue that I also used on the legs, and I sprayed it between the midtones and the shadows of the armor. This way the skin and the metal are integrated together, having the same light reflected on them. The only difference is in how reflective the two materials are. And finally there is the base. You can definitely build and paint a super complex base on a nice stand for these large models, but I opted for something simple that won't steal the show from the figure, but it will still give you the idea of the environment she's in. I try to be consistent with this, using colors that complement the figure and making sure that they match the environmental effects I painted on the armor and the skin. And of course, even on the rock, I made sure to not just paint it in a single color or one color transition. I added a lot of textures and glazed in some additional tones with the airbrush as well. It is relatively dark compared to the model, so it doesn't draw the eye too much, but when you do look at it, there should be enough detail there to make it believable and match with the figure. And once I was done with it and I fixed the model on the base, the end result looked like this. It won't win any awards, but I think it's a pretty nice piece that I'm still happy to look at on my shelf. Definitely better than having the unpainted model in the box. In the end, I think that painting this figure taught me a lot about painting minis in general. It's like looking at your figure with magnifying glasses for the first time. You suddenly see a lot more detail and realize that some of the lines you thought are straight are actually anything but. So next time you will make them straighter and your models suddenly become crisper.
So if you have the chance, try picking up a large scale model and see whether you like it and what you can learn from painting it. But what do you guys think about larger scale models? Have you ever painted one? What was the experience like? Did I leave some important aspect out of this video? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to follow what I did here, you can find the detailed PDF painting guides and the time-lapse videos over at my Patreon. You can find the link in the description. Before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible. Without them, I wouldn't be able to dedicate the time necessary to keep the channel going. And that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys. See you in the next one.